From the colossal spending of World War II to the long-term costs of the Vietnam War, the financial burden of conflict has left nations on the brink of collapse. Wars may be won or lost on the battlefield, but their true cost is often measured in staggering sums of money and human lives. In this video, we'll dive into some of the costliest wars ever fought, uncovering how they impacted not only the nations involved, but also the course of world history. Second Sino-Japanese War. Although most of the costliest wars in history involved the United States, it is not always the case. One of the largest modern wars was the Second Sino-Japanese War, which took place from 1937 to 1945, coinciding with World War II. This coincidence is one of the factors that made World War II a true global war. However, the Sino-Japanese War is often forgotten in Western history books due to the lack of direct involvement by the Allied powers. The Sino-Japanese War primarily took place between China and Japan. At its peak, Japan spent 7,713,150,000 yen per month on the war. To get an accurate figure in today's currency, we need to calculate and adjust for inflation. The estimated results show that Japan spent around $413 million to $1.3 billion per month. The wide estimated range is due to the difficulty of finding an accurate inflation calculator for the Japanese yen during World War II. If we directly convert from yen to US dollars and then adjust for inflation, the figure obtained is $1.3 billion. However, if we adjust for inflation first and then convert to US dollars, we would have to use data from the mid-1950s, which is at least a decade later than the time of the war. Regardless of the calculation method, it is clear that the war consumed a huge amount of money for Japan. Over the course of 8 years, preliminary estimates show that Japan spent at least $39 billion and possibly over $100 billion for this war. The American Civil War. At the start of the Civil War, the United States carried a modest debt of $64.8 million in 1861. However, by the war's end, this number had skyrocketed to an additional $5.2 billion. Adjusted for inflation, the national debt at that time was equivalent to about $87 billion in today's dollars. To fund the war effort, the government passed the Legal Tender Act in 1862. This act allowed the government to issue $500 million in bonds and print paper money in the form of greenbacks. These were the first paper currency of the United States not backed by gold. Essentially, they were government IOUs, used by the public to pay for everything from goods to taxes, with the belief that the government would eventually redeem them for cash. By some other estimates, the total cost of the Civil War was around $7 billion, including both war expenses and human casualties. Of course, valuing human life is extremely difficult. Based on this figure, the average cost per capita for the northern United States was about $139, equivalent to the average per capita GDP for a year. In contrast, the cost for the South was about 3 times higher. The Korean War. Although the Korean War has been the subject of many comedic works in the form of books, movies, and TV shows in the US, the price paid for this war was not small. When it ended in 1953, the estimated total cost of the Korean War was about $30 billion. Adjusted for inflation, this figure amounts to over $308 billion today. The war claimed the lives of 36,000 U.S. soldiers over the course of 3 years, along with over 1 million South Korean civilians and 200,000 North Korean civilians. The Vietnam War. Although the Vietnam War began in 1959, the U.S. officially entered the conflict in 1965 and withdrew its troops in 1973. During those 8 years, the U.S. spent over $168 billion on the war, including $28.5 billion in aid to the Republic of Vietnam government. Adjusted for inflation, this figure amounts to over $1 trillion, and it could even reach $1.25 trillion if calculated from 1969. Notably, the cost of the Vietnam War continues to rise to this day. The U.S. government still spends about $22 billion annually on veterans and their families. Since 1970, the total welfare amount has reached approximately $270 billion. Vietnamese veterans of the Republic of Vietnam also receive benefits, and if their spouses die from war-related causes, their children receive support until they reach adulthood. Furthermore, due to long-term health issues related to PTSD, a common undiagnosed and untreated psychological disorder following trauma during the war, exposure to Agent Orange, and various other illnesses, the U.S. government is committed to providing welfare for Vietnamese veterans of the Republic of Vietnam for many years to come. The Iraq War. The United States engaged in combat in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, and the U.S. military continued to have a presence in the country after the war ended. The total cost of the Iraq War is estimated to be $1.9 trillion, including a range of expenses. Like most wars, the majority of costs were used for daily military operations, including costs for troops on the battlefield and military equipment. However, a significant portion of the budget was lost due to corruption. Numerous corruption scandals involving contractors were exposed in both Iraq and Afghanistan. It is estimated that about one-third of the contract funds were embezzled through fraudulent payment requests. Contractors took advantage of the situation to inflate service prices and embezzle government funds. The total amount lost to corruption in Iraq and Afghanistan is estimated to be between $31 billion and $60 billion. In total, the U.S. government spent $138 billion on contractors, including both legal and illegal contracts. The war in Afghanistan. For over 2 decades, the war in Afghanistan has become a protracted conflict, causing prolonged instability in the region. Although officially ended, its aftermath still lingers, reminding us of the price paid for this war. The estimated total cost of the war is around $2.3 trillion, equivalent to spending $300 million per day throughout its duration. Detailed analysis shows that $800 billion was spent on direct costs, such as food and equipment for soldiers. $85 billion was used for training the Afghan military, which quickly collapsed in the face of the Taliban within a few days. $750 million was used to pay salaries for the Afghan army. Other costs include support for wounded veterans and interest on initial loans. The War of 1812. As one of the earliest wars in U.S. history, the War of 1812 plunged the country into a nearly 20-year-long financial recession. The total cost of the war was around $158 million at that time, equivalent to $2.8 trillion today, after adjusting for inflation. Of this, over $90 million was used to pay for the Army and Navy. The war left the U.S. government in debt by 1814, with unpaid soldier wages, forcing the government to use land as compensation. Fortunately, private millionaires such as David Parrish, Stephen Girard, and John Jacob Astor contributed nearly $16 million, equivalent to $250 million today, to help the country overcome difficulties. World War I. Although not as costly as World War II, World War I shook the world with enormous expenses, estimated to be between $185 billion and $208 billion at that time, equivalent to $3.3 trillion today. Germany, the defeated nation, bore the heaviest financial burden with over $37 billion, equivalent to $686 billion today. The U.S. spent $414 billion, while the U.K. spent $641 billion. Germany's economy nearly collapsed completely after the war, with hyperinflation at an unprecedented level. A loaf of bread cost 428 billion German marks, and 1 USD could be exchanged for 4.2 trillion German marks. This economic devastation paved the way for Hitler's rise later on. The Second World War. The Second World War was the largest and most brutal war in human history. It was also the costliest war, with an estimated total cost of $4.7 trillion, adjusted for inflation. In the final year of the war expenditures accounted for 40% of the U.S. GDP. Part of this enormous cost stemmed from the staggering scale of the Second World War. Today's military forces may have 2.5 million members, while during the Second World War, 12.2 million servicemen were deployed. This massive amount of money was used to produce 41 billion bullets, 303,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 27 aircraft carriers, and countless other weapons and equipment. To cover the expenses, taxes were raised to a record 94% in some countries. To incentivize men to stay in the military, soldiers were paid $50 a month. Nowadays, that amount is not much, but back then, it was more than the salary of most professionals. The Cold War. Although not a literal war, the Cold War, which lasted from 1940 to 1996, was the costliest arms race in history. The United States alone spent a staggering $5.8 trillion on the nuclear arms race, the centerpiece of the Cold War. While it is difficult to determine the exact figures, the former Soviet Union is also believed to have spent a comparable amount. The estimated total cost of the Cold War and maintaining nuclear arsenals amounted to over $10 trillion. History has proven that war is an enormous economic burden, leading to destruction and long-term instability. The aforementioned numbers serve as a clear reminder of the devastating cost of war and call for us to strive for a more peaceful and prosperous world.